Sarah Martinez stood at the kitchen window, her hands trembling as she held the pregnancy test. 3+ signs stared back at her, confirming what the doctor had told her just hours ago. Triplets. She was carrying triplets, and the father was not who everyone thought he was. 6 months ago, her life had been completely different. She had been engaged to Michael Chen, a successful architect who seemed perfect in every way. They had met at a charity gala where she was working as an event coordinator. Michael was charming, ambitious, and came from a wealthy family. His father, Robert Chen, was a renowned businessman who owned several companies across the country. The Chen family lived in a sprawling mansion on the outskirts of the city. Sarah remembered the first time she visited, feeling overwhelmed by the marble floors, crystal chandeliers, and artwork that probably cost more than her annual salary. But Michael had held her hand and whispered that none of it mattered as much as having her by his side. Robert Chen had been polite but distant during their first meeting. He was a widower who had raised Michael alone after his wife passed away when Michael was just 10 years old. There was something intense about the way Robert looked at her, but Sarah had dismissed it as a protective father sizing up his son's fiancée. The wedding preparations had begun immediately. Michael wanted a grand celebration, inviting hundreds of guests to witness their union. Sarah preferred something smaller, but she wanted to make Michael happy. They spent weekends touring venues, tasting cakes, and meeting with wedding planners. Everything seemed to be falling into place perfectly, but then came that terrible night in March. Michael had been working late on a project deadline, and Sarah had decided to surprise him at his office with dinner. She had prepared his favorite meal and driven through the rain to his workplace. When she arrived, the building was mostly dark, except for a few lights on the top floor where Michael's office was located. The security guard recognized her and let her in with a smile. She took the elevator up, balancing the food containers and imagining Michael's surprised face. But when she reached his office, it was empty. His computer was still on, showing blueprints for a new shopping complex, but Michael was nowhere to be found. She heard voices coming from the conference room down the hall. Thinking Michael might be in a late meeting, she walked quietly toward the sound, not wanting to interrupt, but as she got closer, she recognized Michael's voice, and he sounded upset. Through the crack in the door, she saw Michael standing with another man she didn't recognize. They were arguing about money, and Michael kept mentioning debts and threats. The other man was demanding payment for something, and Michael was pleading for more time. Sarah's heart sank as she listened. Michael had never mentioned any financial troubles. He always seemed to have money for expensive dinners, gifts, and their elaborate wedding plans. She backed away from the door, confused and worried, deciding to wait in Michael's office. 20 minutes later, Michael returned looking haggard and stressed. When he saw Sarah, his face went pale. She asked him what was wrong, and after much hesitation, he finally confessed. He had a gambling problem that had spiraled out of control. He owed dangerous people a lot of money, and they were getting impatient. Sarah was shocked. This was not the man she thought she knew. But she loved him, and she wanted to help. She asked how much he owed, and when he told her the figure, she gasped. It was more than she could ever imagine paying back. Michael broke down in tears, saying he had tried everything. He had even asked his father for help, but Robert had refused, saying Michael needed to learn from his mistakes. The wedding would have to be canceled, Michael said, because he couldn't afford it anymore. Worse, he might have to leave town to escape the people he owed money to. Sarah held him as he cried, her own tears falling silently. Everything they had planned, their entire future together, was crumbling before her eyes. She told him they would figure it out together. But deep down, she wasn't sure how. The next few weeks were a blur of anxiety and fear. Michael became increasingly paranoid, constantly looking over his shoulder and jumping at every phone call. He moved in with Sarah temporarily, afraid to stay at his own apartment. They barely slept, and when they did, nightmares plagued them both. One evening, Robert showed up at Sarah's apartment unexpectedly. Michael wasn't home, having gone to meet with a lawyer about his options. Robert looked tired and older than his 60 years, the stress of his son's situation clearly weighing on him. He sat on Sarah's couch and asked her directly what she planned to do. Was she going to stay with Michael despite everything? Sarah said she loved Michael and wanted to help him through this crisis. Robert studied her for a long moment before making a shocking proposition. He would pay off Michael's debts, all of them, but there was a condition. Michael would have to leave the country for at least a year, maybe longer, to let things cool down and to get treatment for his gambling addiction. Robert had connections in Europe where Michael could work and get help, but Michael would have to go alone. Sarah was stunned. A year or more without Michael? But she also knew this might be his only chance to escape this mess and get his life back on track. When Michael came home and heard his father's offer, he was initially resistant. But as they discussed it more, he realized he had no choice. The plan was set in motion quickly. Michael would leave in a week for Switzerland, where Robert had arranged a job and a therapist who specialized in addiction. Sarah would wait for him, and when he returned, they could start fresh. The wedding was officially postponed indefinitely. The night before Michael left, they spent together, holding each other and making promises about the future. Michael swore he would get better and come back to her. Sarah promised to wait, no matter how long it took. Neither of them knew that this would be the last time they would see each other. Michael left on a rainy Tuesday morning. Sarah drove him to the airport, and they said their tearful goodbyes at the security checkpoint. She watched him disappear into the crowd of travelers, her heart breaking with each step he took away from her. For the first few weeks, they communicated regularly. Michael called every day, telling her about his new job and the therapy sessions. He sounded hopeful and determined. Sarah threw herself into work, trying to keep busy and not think too much about how empty her apartment felt. But then, something strange began to happen. Robert started showing up more frequently, checking on her, bringing her food, offering to help with things around the apartment. At first, Sarah appreciated the gesture, thinking he was just being kind, but his visits became more frequent and lasted longer. One evening, about 2 months after Michael had left, Robert brought over an expensive bottle of wine and insisted they have dinner together. He said he was lonely in that big house by himself and enjoyed her company. Sarah felt uncomfortable but didn't want to be rude to her future father-in-law. As they ate, Robert began talking about his late wife and how much Sarah reminded him of her. He spoke of his loneliness and how difficult it had been raising Michael alone. The wine flowed freely, and Sarah found herself drinking more than she intended, trying to ease her own loneliness and anxiety. The conversation became more personal as the night wore on. Robert moved closer to her on the couch, and Sarah felt increasingly uneasy. When she tried to excuse herself to go to bed, Robert suddenly confessed that he had feelings for her. He said he had been attracted to her from the moment Michael introduced them. Sarah was horrified. She told Robert this was inappropriate and asked him to leave. But Robert persisted, saying Michael didn't deserve her, that he had always been weak and irresponsible. Robert could take care of her properly, give her the life she deserved. The situation escalated quickly. Sarah tried to get up, but Robert grabbed her arm. In her intoxicated state, she struggled to break free. What happened next was a blur of confusion, fear, and things she would later desperately try to forget. When Sarah woke up the next morning, Robert was gone. She felt sick, not just from the wine but from the fragmented memories of the night before. She showered for what felt like hours, trying to wash away the feeling of violation and betrayal. She wanted to call Michael, to tell him everything. But what would she say? That his father had taken advantage of her? It would destroy their relationship and the entire family. She decided to keep quiet, hoping to never see Robert again. But avoiding Robert proved impossible. He continued to insert himself into her life, showing up at her workplace, calling constantly, and even threatening to tell Michael a twisted version of events if she didn't continue seeing him. Sarah felt trapped in a nightmare with no way out. The calls from Michael became harder to take. He talked about their future, about the progress he was making in therapy, about how much he missed her. Each conversation felt like a knife twisting in Sarah's heart. She loved Michael, but she was being controlled by his father in ways that made her feel sick and ashamed. 3 months after that horrible night, Sarah realized her period was late. She attributed it to stress at first, but when the nausea started and her clothes began feeling tight, she knew she had to take a test. The positive results sent her into a panic. She made a doctor's appointment, hoping against hope that she was wrong. But the ultrasound confirmed not only that she was pregnant, but that she was carrying triplets. The doctor called it rare but not impossible, especially given her family history of multiple births that she had never thought to mention before. The reality of her situation crashed down on her. She was pregnant with Robert's children, while engaged to Michael. The scandal this would cause, the destruction of the family, the shame and judgment she would face, it was all too much to bear. Robert's reaction to the news was not what she expected. Instead of panic or denial, he seemed almost pleased. He talked about taking care of her and the babies, about them being a family. His delusions terrified Sarah more than his threats ever had. He began making plans, talking about nurseries and nannies, as if this was all perfectly normal. Sarah knew she had to escape. She couldn't bring these children into such a twisted situation. She couldn't face Michael when he returned. Couldn't pretend everything was fine while carrying his father's triplets. The weight of the secret was crushing her spirit day by day. She started planning carefully. She would need money, a place to go where Robert couldn't find her, and a new identity if possible. She began saving every penny she could, selling jewelry and anything valuable she owned. She researched cities far away where she could disappear and start over. The morning sickness was brutal, made worse by the stress of maintaining appearances. At work, she hid her condition with loose clothing and excuses about a stomach bug. She avoided friends who might notice the changes in her body or behavior. Every day was a performance, pretending to be the same Sarah, while inside she was falling apart. Robert's possessiveness grew as her pregnancy progressed. He hired someone to follow her, claiming it was for her protection. He showed up at her apartment at all hours, sometimes with baby items he had purchased. His obsession with the babies and with her was becoming dangerous. One night, she overheard Robert on the phone talking to someone about Michael. He was saying that Michael didn't need to come back, that he was better off staying in Europe permanently. The casual way Robert discussed keeping his own son away forever chilled Sarah to the bone. She realized that Robert would do anything to keep his twisted secret and maintain control over her. That was when Sarah knew she had to run immediately. She couldn't wait any longer to execute her carefully laid plans. Robert was becoming more unstable, more controlling, and she feared what he might do if she stayed. The safety of her unborn children depended on her getting far away from this man who had destroyed her life. She thought about Michael constantly, wondering what he would think if he knew the truth. Would he blame her? Would he understand that his father had manipulated and trapped her? Part of her wanted to tell him everything, but she knew it would only cause him more pain. He was finally getting his life together, and this news would destroy him. The guilt ate at her day and night. She had loved Michael, truly and deeply, had planned to spend her life with him. Now, she was carrying his father's children and planning to disappear forever. The injustice of it all made her rage at times, while other moments found her sobbing uncontrollably. As her belly grew with the 3 lives inside her, Sarah felt more isolated than ever. She couldn't share her joy or fear with anyone. Doctor's appointments were solitary affairs, where she smiled and nodded while dying inside. The babies were healthy, the doctor assured her. But how could anything good come from such a horrible situation? She found herself talking to her unborn children late at night, apologizing for the circumstances of their conception, promising them a better life away from the chaos and dysfunction of the Chen family. They would never know their biological father or their half-brother who should have been their father. It was a sacrifice she had to make for their safety and well-being. The final straw came when Robert presented her with legal documents. He wanted her to sign papers that would give him parental rights and custody arrangements. He spoke of marriage after a decent interval. Once Michael was settled in Europe, the casual cruelty of his plans, the way he had orchestrated everything, made Sarah physically ill. That night, she made her final preparations. She had saved enough money to get by for a few months. She had researched a small town across the country where she could rent a cheap apartment, and find work. She had even contacted a women's shelter along the way in case she needed emergency help. As she packed her few essential belongings, Sarah allowed herself one last moment of grief for the life she had lost. She looked at photos of Michael, of their happy times together, of the future they had planned. Then she deleted everything from her phone and computer that could be used to track her. The hardest part was writing the letter to Michael. She couldn't tell him the truth, but she couldn't leave without any explanation either. After many attempts, she settled on vague words about not being able to wait, about needing to find herself, about wishing him all the best. It was cowardly, she knew, but it was better than the devastating truth. She left the letter with a trusted friend who promised to mail it to Michael in a month, giving Sarah time to disappear completely. By then, she would be in another state, probably with a different name, starting a new life with 3 babies, who would never know the dark story of their beginning. As dawn broke on the day of her escape, Sarah took one last look around her apartment. Everything she couldn't take would be left behind, including the engagement ring Michael had given her. She placed it on the kitchen counter with a note for the landlord, then walked out the door and toward an uncertain future. The taxi to the bus station felt like the longest ride of her life. Every car behind them could be one of Robert's people. Every stop at a red light made her heart pound with fear. But finally, she arrived at the station and purchased a ticket with cash for a destination several states away. As the bus pulled out of the station, Sarah allowed herself a small sigh of relief. She was really doing this, really escaping. Her hand rested on her growing belly where 3 innocent lives depended on her strength and courage. She didn't know what the future held, but it had to be better than the prison she was leaving behind. The city skyline faded in the distance as the bus carried her toward a new life. Sarah closed her eyes and tried not to think about Michael waking up in Switzerland, going about his day, not knowing that his entire world had shifted. She tried not to think about Robert discovering her absence and the rage that would follow. Instead, she focused on the road ahead, on the small town where no one would know her story, where she could raise her children in peace. It wouldn't be easy, but it would be honest in a way her life hadn't been for months. The truth might be buried, but at least she would be free. The bus journey stretched on for 18 hours, with multiple stops in small towns Sarah had never heard of before. Her back ached from the uncomfortable seat, and the babies seemed to be doing gymnastics inside her belly. Every time someone new boarded the bus, she tensed, pulling her jacket tighter around herself and keeping her face turned toward the window. She had chosen the town of Cedar Falls not because she knew anything about it, but because it was far enough away and small enough to disappear in. The population was just under 8,000 people, and the main industries were farming and a small textile factory. It was the kind of place where everyone knew everyone else, which could be both a blessing and a curse. When the bus finally arrived at Cedar Falls, it was nearly midnight. The station was little more than a covered bench outside a closed gas station. Sarah stood there, with her single suitcase, feeling the weight of her decision. The main street was deserted except for a few streetlights casting yellow pools on the empty sidewalk. She had booked a room at the only motel in town for the week, paying cash and giving the name Anna Walker. The elderly man at the desk barely looked up from his newspaper as he handed her the key. Room 12 was small and smelled of old cigarette smoke, but it had a bed and a door that locked, which was all Sarah needed for now. That first night in Cedar Falls, she barely slept. Every sound outside made her jump. Was that a car slowing down? Were those footsteps? But morning came without incident, bringing with it the chirping of birds and the distant sound of farm equipment starting up for the day. Sarah's first task was finding more permanent accommodation. The motel was too expensive for long-term stay, and she needed to conserve her money. She walked through town, noting the small grocery store, the diner, the library, and the medical clinic. Everything was within walking distance, which was good since she couldn't afford a car. At the diner, she ordered breakfast and scanned the local newspaper's classified section. A waitress named Betty, a woman in her 50s with kind eyes and gray-streaked hair, noticed her circling rental ads. "You new in town, honey?" Betty asked while refilling Sarah's coffee cup. "Yes," Sarah replied carefully. "I'm looking for a fresh start." Betty's eyes flickered to Sarah's belly. which was becoming harder to hide despite the loose clothing. "Well, Cedar Falls is good for fresh starts. You looking for a place to rent?" Sarah nodded, and Betty's face lit up. "My sister Dorothy has a small apartment above her flower shop. Nothing fancy, but it's clean and affordable. She's been looking for a tenant who can help out in the shop part-time in exchange for reduced rent." It seemed too good to be true, but Sarah met Dorothy that afternoon. Dorothy was younger than Betty, with the same kind eyes and a no-nonsense attitude. She showed Sarah the apartment, a one-bedroom space with a tiny kitchen and a living area that overlooked Main Street. "When are you due?" Dorothy asked bluntly, noticing Sarah's protective hand over her belly. 4 months, Sarah admitted, then took a deep breath. "It's triplets." Dorothy's eyebrows shot up. "Triplets? Lord have mercy. And the father? Not in the picture," Sarah said quietly. "It's just me." Dorothy studied her for a long moment, then nodded. "Well, Anna, we all have our stories. The apartment's yours if you want it. You can start helping in the shop when you feel up to it, and we'll figure out the rest after the babies come." Sarah could have cried with relief. She moved in that evening, her meager possessions looking even smaller in the empty apartment. But it was hers, at least for now. And that was enough. The flower shop, Dorothy's Blooms, became Sarah's sanctuary. She learned to arrange bouquets, tend to the plants, and handle customer orders. Dorothy was patient with her, especially on days when morning sickness still hit hard, or when the baby's movements made it difficult to stand for long periods. The people of Cedar Falls were curious about the newcomer, but mostly respectful of her privacy. Sarah stuck to her story. She was Anna Walker, starting over after a difficult situation. Most people assumed she was fleeing an abusive relationship and didn't press for details. At the medical clinic, Dr. Marcus, an older man who had delivered half the babies in Cedar Falls, took her case. He was concerned about her carrying triplets without having a support system but impressed by her determination. He arranged for her to see a specialist in the city once a month, warning her that multiple births often came early and could have complications. The weeks passed in a blur of work, doctor's appointments, and preparation. Sarah used her small savings to buy essentials from the thrift store, a crib that would have to do for all 3 babies at first, clothes, diapers, and bottles. Dorothy and Betty helped when they could, bringing over baby items their own children had outgrown. It was during her 7th month of pregnancy that the first sign of trouble appeared. Sarah was arranging roses in the shop when a man in an expensive suit walked in. He wasn't from Cedar Falls. His clothes and demeanor screamed city. He bought a small bouquet and asked casual questions about the town. Mentioning he was looking for someone, Sarah kept her head down, focusing on the flowers, but her hands shook. After he left, Dorothy noticed her distress. "You okay, honey? You look like you've seen a ghost." Sarah made an excuse about feeling dizzy and went upstairs to her apartment. From her window, she watched the man get into a black sedan and drive slowly down Main Street. It could be nothing, just a traveler passing through. But her instincts screamed danger. That night, she called the friend who was supposed to mail the letter to Michael. Had she sent it? Yes, 3 weeks ago as instructed. Had anyone contacted her about Sarah? There had been calls, the friend admitted nervously, from Michael's father. He was looking for her. Seemed very upset. Sarah hung up with trembling hands. Robert was looking for her. Of course he was. A man like him wouldn't just let her disappear with his unborn grandchildren. She had been naive to think she could simply vanish. The next few days were tense. Sarah varied her routines, stayed inside more, and kept watch for the black sedan. But it didn't reappear. And gradually, she allowed herself to relax slightly. Maybe the man really had just been passing through. Her belly was enormous now, stretched tight with 3 growing babies. Dr. Marcus was monitoring her closely, warning that she could go into labor at any time. She had a hospital bag packed and a plan for Dorothy to drive her to the city hospital when the time came. It was a quiet Thursday evening when her phone rang. She had kept it only for emergencies, giving the number to no one except Dorothy and Dr. Marcus. The caller ID showed an unknown number. Against her better judgment, she answered, "Sarah." The voice made her blood run cold. Robert had found her phone number. She hung up immediately, her heart pounding so hard she worried it might hurt the babies. The phone rang again. And again. She turned it off and threw it in a drawer. But the damage was done. He knew she was still using this phone. The next morning, she bought a cheap prepaid phone with cash and gave the new number only to Dorothy. She destroyed the old phone, breaking the SIM card into pieces. But the fear remained. If Robert had found her number, what else did he know? Her anxiety affected everything. She jumped at shadows, couldn't sleep, and barely ate. Dorothy noticed her deterioration and demanded to know what was wrong. In a moment of desperation, Sarah told her a version of the truth. That her ex's father was stalking her. That he was dangerous. That she was terrified he would find her. Dorothy's reaction was fierce and protective. She contacted her nephew, who was a deputy sheriff, and asked him to keep an eye out for strangers in town. She installed new locks on the apartment door and started closing the shop earlier so Sarah wouldn't be alone after dark. The support from Dorothy and others in Cedar Falls touched Sarah deeply. These people who barely knew her were protecting her and her unborn children. It was more kindness than she had experienced in months. 2 weeks before her due date, Sarah woke to a puddle beneath her. Her water had broken. The contractions started soon after, coming fast and hard. Dorothy rushed her to the city hospital, driving through the pre-dawn darkness while Sarah gripped the door handle and tried to breathe through the pain. The delivery was long and complicated. The first baby, a boy, came relatively quickly, but the second, another boy, was positioned wrong and required intervention. By the time the third baby, a girl, was ready to be born, Sarah was exhausted beyond anything she had ever experienced. But finally, after 14 hours of labor, all 3 babies were here. They were small but healthy, each weighing just over 4 pounds. Sarah held them one at a time, tears streaming down her face. They were perfect, despite everything. 3 tiny humans who deserved better than the circumstances of their conception. She named them James, Henry, and Lily. Simple names for a simple life, she hoped. The nurses were amazed by her stamina and determination, not knowing the full weight of what she was running from. The first few weeks home with the triplets were a blur of feeding, changing, and trying to snatch moments of sleep. Dorothy and Betty organized a rotation of women from town to help, bringing meals and holding babies so Sarah could shower or nap. It was during one of these quiet moments, with a church volunteer named Mabel rocking Henry, while Sarah fed Lily, that she saw him. Robert's car drove slowly past the flower shop. Her blood turned to ice as she recognized his profile in the driver's seat. She whispered urgently to Mabel that she wasn't feeling well and needed to lie down. As soon as the older woman left with promises to return tomorrow, Sarah began packing. She had to run again. Robert had found her, but as she looked at her 3 tiny babies, all finally sleeping peacefully in their shared crib, she realized the impossibility of her situation. How could she run with newborn triplets? Where would she go? She had no money left, having spent everything on baby supplies and medical bills. A knock at the door made her freeze. It was too late. He had found her. "Sarah, I know you're in there." Robert's voice was calm, controlled, but she could hear the underlying threat. "Open the door. We need to talk about my grandchildren." Sarah didn't move, barely breathed. Maybe he would go away if she stayed silent. "I've been very patient," Robert continued. "I've given you space to have the babies safely. But this game ends now. Those are my children too. And I have rights." The babies stirred at the sound of his voice, and Lily began to whimper. Sarah picked her up, trying to soothe her quietly, but it was too late. Lily's cries woke her brothers, and soon all 3 were wailing. "I hear them," Robert said, and now his voice had an edge of excitement. "My grandchildren. Sarah, be reasonable. You can't raise 3 children alone. You need my help." Sarah's mind raced. She couldn't call the police. What would she tell them? That the grandfather of her children wanted to see them? She had no restraining order, no legal protection, and Robert had money for lawyers while she had nothing. The knocking became pounding. "Open this door, or I'll have the police open it for me. I'll tell them you kidnapped my grandchildren." Tears streaming down her face, Sarah made a decision. She couldn't run, but she wouldn't give in either. She grabbed her new phone and called Dorothy, whispering urgently for help. Within minutes, Dorothy arrived with her nephew, Deputy Jake Morrison. Robert was still at the door, now threatening legal action, and worse. Jake's presence in uniform made Robert step back slightly. "Is there a problem here?" Jake asked calmly. "This woman has my grandchildren," Robert said smoothly. "I'm simply trying to ensure their welfare." Jake looked between them. "Ma'am, do you want this man here?" "No," Sarah said firmly. "Please make him leave." Robert's face darkened. "You can't keep me from my grandchildren. I'll get a court order. I'll prove you're an unfit mother. You have no job, no money, no support system." "She has us," Dorothy said fiercely, stepping beside Sarah. "This whole town is her support system. And if you don't leave right now, you'll be dealing with more than just one deputy." As if on cue, several people emerged from neighboring buildings. Betty from the diner, Dr. Marcus, the church ladies, even the motel owner. All stood witness to Robert's harassment. Cedar Falls was protecting its own. Robert looked around, realizing he was outnumbered. "This isn't over," he said coldly. "I'll be back with lawyers." After he drove away, Sarah collapsed into Dorothy's arms, sobbing. The truth came pouring out. Not everything, but enough. Robert wasn't just her ex's father. He had forced himself on her. The babies were products of assault. She had fled to protect them and herself. The room was silent for a moment, then filled with furious murmuring. Dr. Marcus was the first to speak. "We need to document this properly. You need legal protection." Jake agreed. "There are resources for situations like this. Restraining orders, victim advocacy groups. You should have told someone sooner." But Sarah knew the complexity of her situation. How could she prove assault from months ago? Robert would claim it was consensual. Paint her as a gold digger who seduced him and ran when she got pregnant. He had power, influence, and unlimited resources. That night, after everyone had left and the babies were settled, Sarah sat by the window keeping watch. Robert was still in town. She could feel it. He wouldn't give up easily. The brief victory of community support felt hollow in the face of his determination. Her phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. Her hands shook as she opened it. It was a photo of Michael, looking gaunt and confused, standing in what appeared to be an airport. The message read, "I told him everything. He's coming home. How will you explain this to him?" Sarah's heart shattered. Robert had played his ultimate card. He had brought Michael back into this nightmare. Her carefully constructed house of cards was about to collapse completely. She looked at her sleeping babies, so innocent and unaware of the chaos surrounding their existence. James had Michael's nose. Henry had the Chen family's distinctive eyes. Lily looked exactly like Sarah's baby pictures. They were perfect and doomed at the same time. As dawn broke over Cedar Falls, Sarah made the most difficult decision of her life. She couldn't run anymore. Couldn't hide. For better or worse, she would have to face both Robert and Michael. But she would do it on her terms, with the truth as her only weapon. She picked up her phone and did something she never thought she would do. She called Michael's number. It rang, once, twice, then his familiar voice answered, confused and broken. "Sarah? Is it really you?" My father said. "He told me. Please tell me it's not true." Sarah closed her eyes, gathering every ounce of courage she had left. "Michael, we need to talk. The truth is more complicated than whatever your father told you. Where are you?" His voice was desperate. "I'll come to you. We can figure this out together." Looking at her babies, Sarah gave him the address. Whatever happened next, at least the lies would end. The truth might destroy everything, but living in fear and deception was already destroying her soul. As she waited for Michael to arrive, Sarah held her children close. She whispered promises to them that she would be strong, that she would protect them no matter what. Outside, Cedar Falls was waking up to a new day, unaware that a storm was about to break over their quiet town. The sound of cars on Main Street made her tense. Any one of them could be Michael, coming to learn a truth that would shatter his world. Or it could be Robert, returning with his threats and lawyers. Either way, Sarah's time in hiding was over. She dressed carefully, fed the babies, and prepared for the confrontation she had been running from for months. The woman in the mirror looked older, harder, but also somehow stronger than the naive event coordinator who had fallen in love with a charming architect a lifetime ago. When the knock finally came, gentle and hesitant rather than demanding, she knew it was Michael. Taking a deep breath, she walked to the door. It was time to face the consequences of that terrible night and fight for her children's future, whatever that might hold. Sarah's hand trembled as she opened the door. Michael stood there, looking like a shadow of his former self. His usually neat hair was disheveled, his clothes wrinkled from travel, and his eyes held a pain she had never seen before. For a moment, they just stared at each other, the weight of everything unsaid hanging between them. "Sarah," he whispered, and his voice broke on her name. "The babies. My father said there are babies." Ofer. Before she could respond, a cry came from inside the apartment. Then another. The triplets had woken from their morning nap, their timing as synchronized as always. Michael's eyes widened at the sound. "Come in," Sarah said quietly, stepping aside. "You need to hear the whole truth." Michael entered the small apartment, his eyes taking in the cramped space, the baby items scattered everywhere, and finally landing on the crib where 3 tiny humans were beginning to fuss. He approached slowly, as if in a dream, and looked down at James, Henry, and Lily. "3, he breathed. "There are 3 of them." Sarah picked up Lily, who was crying the loudest, and held her close. "Michael, please sit down. What I'm about to tell you, it's going to be hard to hear." He sank onto the worn couch, his eyes never leaving the babies. "My father said you seduced him, that you were after money, that when you got pregnant, you ran to extort him." His voice was mechanical, repeating words he didn't seem to believe. "Your father is a monster," Sarah said flatly. And Michael flinched at her tone. "He didn't tell you what really happened that night." She told him everything. The loneliness after he left, Robert's increasing visits, the dinner he insisted on, the wine. And then, she couldn't say the words exactly. But Michael understood. His face went from pale to flushed with rage as the truth sank in. "No," he said, standing abruptly. "My father wouldn't. He couldn't. I tried to forget it happened," Sarah continued, tears flowing freely now. "I couldn't tell you. You were finally getting better, getting your life together. How could I destroy that with this horrible truth?" Michael began pacing, running his hands through his hair. "But you left. You disappeared. You took them and ran. I had no choice." Sarah's voice rose, causing Lily to whimper. She lowered it, rocking the baby gently. "He was becoming obsessed. He wanted to control me, to own me, and the babies. He even talked about keeping you in Europe permanently." The door burst open suddenly, making them both jump. Robert stood there, having followed Michael to Cedar Falls. His face was a mask of cold fury as he took in the scene. "I see you couldn't wait to poison him against me," Robert said to Sarah, filling his head with lies. "Get out," Michael said, his voice deadly quiet. "Get out right now." Robert laughed. A harsh sound. "You're going to believe her over your own father? This gold digger who couldn't wait for you to come back? Look at the facts. Son, she was lonely. I was there. Things happened. Now she regrets it and wants to play the victim. She was never that kind of person," Michael said, moving to stand between his father and Sarah. "I know her. I know you. And looking at you now, I believe every word she said. Robert's composure cracked slightly. Those are my grandchildren. I have rights. They're my children, Sarah said firmly, finding strength in Michael's support. And you'll never come near them again. We'll see what the courts say about that, Robert threatened. A single mother with no income, living in this dump, versus a grandfather who can provide everything they need. Dorothy appeared in the doorway, with Jake the deputy behind her. Everything okay here, Anna? She asked, using Sarah's assumed name but looking pointedly at Robert. This man is trespassing, Sarah said. He's been asked to leave multiple times. Jake stepped forward. Sir, you need to leave now, or I'll have to arrest you. Robert looked around the room, calculating his options. This isn't over, he said finally. You can't keep me from my blood. They're not your blood, Michael said, his voice shaking with rage. They're your victims. Just like Sarah. Just like me. Something in Michael's words made Robert pause. What are you talking about? My whole life. You controlled everything. Who I could see. What I could do. Where I could go. You isolated Mom before she died. And you tried to do the same to me. When I finally found someone who loved me for me, you couldn't stand it. You had to destroy it. Possess it. Control it. Michael's words poured out years of suppressed anger and realization. The gambling wasn't just my weakness, it was my escape from you. And when you sent me away, I actually started to heal, but you couldn't let me be happy, could you? You had to take even Sarah from me. Robert's face contorted. Everything I did was for you, for our family. No, Michael cut him off. Everything you did was for yourself, your ego, your control, your sick needs. But it ends now. Jake stepped closer to Robert. Sir, final warning. Leave now. Robert looked at each face in the room, his son's disgust, Sarah's fear mixed with determination, Dorothy's protective stance, and the deputy's hand resting on his service weapon. He straightened his expensive suit and walked to the door. You'll be hearing from my lawyers, he said coldly, then left. The room was silent for a moment after his departure. Then Henry started crying, which set off James, and soon all three babies were wailing. The mundane chaos of infant needs broke the tension. Let me help, Michael said softly, approaching the crib hesitantly. May I? Sarah nodded, and Michael gently picked up Henry, holding him awkwardly but carefully. The baby settled slightly at the new voice and touch, looking up at Michael with curious eyes. He has the Chen eyes, Michael murmured. My grandmother's eyes. Dorothy and Jake quietly excused themselves, sensing this was a private moment. Sarah fed James while Michael walked with Henry, and Lily dozed in her bouncer. It was strangely domestic and heartbreaking at the same time. I'm sorry, Michael said suddenly. For all of it. For leaving you alone. For having a father capable of such evil. For not protecting you. You couldn't have known, Sarah replied. And you needed to get help. I never blamed you for leaving. They talked for hours as the babies cycled through their needs. Michael told her about his time in Switzerland. The therapy. The realizations about his father's toxic influence throughout his life. Sarah shared the fear and loneliness of the past months. The kindness of Cedar Falls. And her terror when Robert found her. What do we do now? Michael asked finally. He won't give up. He'll use every resource, every connection. Sarah had been thinking about this since Robert's threat. We need our own lawyer. And we need to document everything. Dr. Marcus has medical records from when I first arrived, showing my condition. Dorothy and others can testify about my fear, about Robert showing up here. I'll testify too, Michael said firmly. About his controlling nature, his obsession with our relationship. About things I witnessed growing up that I normalized but now realize were signs of his disturbed personality. But they both knew Robert had advantages. Money for the best lawyers, connections in the legal system, and the ability to drag out a court battle until Sarah was bankrupted. The odds were stacked against them. There might be another way, Michael said slowly. What if we got married? Sarah stared at him. Michael, hear me out, he continued quickly. If we're married, I'm their legal father. We present a united front, a stable family unit. It takes away his grandparent rights argument. And, he paused, looking at the babies. I know they're not biologically mine, but looking at them, holding them, I feel something. They're innocent in all this. They deserve a father who will love and protect them. You can't sacrifice yourself out of guilt, Sarah protested. We're not the same people we were before. Too much has happened. I'm not proposing we pretend nothing happened, Michael said. But we loved each other once. Real love. Maybe we can find our way back to that. Or maybe we can't. But either way, we can protect these children together. Sarah looked at him holding Henry, saw James peaceful in her arms, watched Lily sleeping soundly. They did deserve protection, stability, love. But was this the way? I need time to think, she said finally. This is all too much. Too fast. Michael nodded. I'll get a room at the motel. I'm not leaving Cedar Falls until we figure this out. My father doesn't get to win this time. Over the next days, Michael proved his commitment. He found a local lawyer who, while not as high-powered as Robert's team would be, was smart and determined. He helped with the babies, learning their different cries and personalities. He even started working remotely for a new company, showing he could provide financial stability. The legal letter from Robert's lawyers arrived within a week. He was seeking grandparent visitation rights, claiming Sarah was an unfit mother who had kidnapped his grandchildren. The documents were thick with accusations and twisted half-truths. Their lawyer, Margaret Chen, no relation, despite the shared surname, reviewed everything with a grim expression. He's throwing everything at the wall to see what sticks. But we have advantages too. This is a small-town court, not his big city territory. Judges here tend to side with mothers, especially in cases involving assault. Can we prove the assault? Sarah asked. Your immediate flight. Your condition when you arrived here. The documentation Dr. Marcus kept. It all supports your story. Plus, if Michael testifies about his father's controlling behavior and obsessions, it builds a pattern. They prepared for battle. Sarah gave a detailed statement about that night. Painful as it was to relive, Michael provided examples of his father's disturbing behavior over the years. Dorothy and others from Cedar Falls wrote character references for Sarah, describing her as a devoted mother who had fled in fear. The court date was set for 6 weeks later. In the meantime, Robert was barred from contacting Sarah or coming near the children. It was a small victory, but Sarah still slept poorly, jumping at every sound. Michael had essentially moved to Cedar Falls, renting a small house near Sarah's apartment. He was there every day, helping with the babies, bringing groceries, and slowly rebuilding their connection. It wasn't the passionate romance of before. Too much had changed for that. But it was something deeper, forged in shared trauma and mutual protection of 3 innocent lives. One evening, as they sat exhausted after getting all 3 babies to sleep, Michael brought up marriage again. I know you said you needed time, but the court date is coming. It would strengthen our case. Sarah had been thinking about little else. If we do this, we do it right. No lies. No pretending. We tell the judge exactly why we're together, to protect the children and build a real family for them. We admit the complexity but emphasize our commitment. And us? Michael asked. What about us? We take it day by day, Sarah said. We focus on being good parents first. If more develops, we let it happen naturally. If not, we'll figure out how to co-parent with respect and kindness. They got married at the Cedar Falls courthouse a week before the custody hearing. It was nothing like the grand wedding they had once planned. Dorothy and Betty were witnesses, and the babies slept through the brief ceremony in their triple stroller. But when Michael slipped a simple band on Sarah's finger, she felt something she hadn't experienced in months. Hope. The custody hearing was brutal. Robert's lawyers painted Sarah as a calculating woman who had seduced a vulnerable older man and then fled with his money. They questioned her mental stability, her ability to care for 3 infants, and her sudden marriage to Michael. But Margaret Chen was ready. She presented evidence of Robert's pattern of control, testimonies from Cedar Falls residents about Sarah's character and fear, and medical documentation supporting her version of events. When Michael took the stand, his testimony about his father's lifelong manipulation and control was devastating. The judge, an older woman named Helen Carter, listened to everything with a stern expression. When Robert took the stand, playing the wronged grandfather just wanting to see his grandchildren, she asked pointed questions that revealed the holes in his story. The most powerful moment came when Judge Carter asked to see the babies. Sarah brought them in, and they were perfect. Quiet, alert, dressed in the little outfits Dorothy had bought for the occasion. The judge observed how Sarah and Michael worked together to manage them, how the babies responded to both parents, and how they shrank from Robert when he stepped too close. "Mr. Chen," Judge Carter said finally, "I've heard a lot of testimony today. What strikes me most is not what was said, but what wasn't. Not once did you express concern for Miss Walker's well-being after what you claim was a consensual encounter. Not once did you acknowledge the trauma she clearly experienced. Your focus has been entirely on possession, not on what's best for these children," she continued. "Furthermore, your son's testimony paints a disturbing picture of controlling behavior that I cannot ignore. While grandparents do have rights in this state, those rights do not supersede the safety and well-being of the children or their mother." The ruling was decisive. Robert was denied any visitation rights. A restraining order was put in place, protecting Sarah, Michael, and the children. If he wanted to pursue further legal action, he would have to prove a significant change in circumstances. Robert's face was purple with rage as the decision was read. He started to speak, but his lawyer wisely hushed him. As they left the courthouse, he shot one last venomous look at Sarah and Michael before disappearing into his expensive car. "It's over," Michael said, sagging with relief. "For now," Sarah corrected. She knew Robert wouldn't give up entirely. But they had won this battle, and that was enough for today. The drive back to Cedar Falls was quiet except for the babies babbling. Sarah watched the familiar buildings come into view. The diner, where Betty had first helped her. The flower shop where Dorothy had given her a chance. The clinic, where Dr. Marcus had cared for her without judgment. This small town had saved her life. That night, after the babies were asleep, Sarah and Michael sat on the porch of his rented house. The spring air was warm and filled with the scent of Dorothy's flowers from down the street. "Thank you," Sarah said simply. "For believing me. For standing up to him. For everything." "I should thank you," Michael replied. "For surviving what he did. For protecting our children." "Our children?" Sarah looked at him in surprise. "If you'll let them be," Michael said. "Biology doesn't make a father. Choice does. And I choose them. I choose you. However long it takes, whatever form it takes, I want to be here." Sarah felt tears sliding down her cheeks. They weren't the tears of fear and desperation she had cried so many times over the past months. These were tears of relief, of possibility, of a future that might actually be happy. "We have a long way to go," she warned. "Trust has to be rebuilt. Trauma has to be processed. 3 babies have to be raised." "I know," Michael said. "But we're not doing it alone. We have each other. And we have this town. That's more than most people get." Inside, one of the babies stirred, starting the chain reaction that would have them all awake soon. Sarah and Michael looked at each other and laughed, the sound carrying across the quiet street. They went inside together to tend to their children, leaving the darkness of the past on the porch. Months passed. Robert made a few more legal attempts, each one failing as judges saw through his manipulations. Eventually, his lawyers advised him to stop wasting money on a lost cause. He disappeared from their lives as suddenly as he had tried to control them, though Sarah knew he was still out there, seething and planning. Michael officially adopted the triplets on their first birthday. The Cedar Falls community threw a massive party in the town square. with Dorothy's flowers everywhere and Betty's diner providing the food. The babies, now mobile and into everything, delighted in the attention. Sarah and Michael's relationship grew slowly but steadily. They went to couples therapy, working through the trauma and betrayal that had brought them together in such a twisted way. Some days were harder than others, but they were committed to healing and to providing a stable, loving home for James, Henry, and Lily. The flower shop expanded, with Sarah becoming a full partner. Michael found he loved small-town life and started an architectural firm specializing in sustainable rural development. They moved into a larger house on Maple Street, with a big backyard for the children to play in. On the triplets' second birthday, as Sarah watched them chase bubbles in the backyard while Michael grilled burgers for their friends, she realized something profound. Out of the worst experience of her life had come her greatest blessings. Not just the children, though they were the center of everything, but also the community that had embraced her, the strength she had found in herself, and the love that had managed to survive and transform despite everything Robert had tried to possess and control, to take what wasn't freely given. He had failed because Sarah had refused to be a victim. She had run not out of weakness but out of strength, protecting not just herself but 3 innocent lives. And in running, she had found exactly where she belonged. As the sun set over Cedar Falls, painting the sky in shades of pink and gold, Sarah picked up Lily, who had fallen and scraped her knee. Michael scooped up the boys, who were getting sleepy despite their protests. Together, they carried their children inside, where Dorothy and Betty and all their chosen family waited with cake and love and the promise of many more birthdays to come. The father had taken his son's place through violence and manipulation, but in the end, the son had taken it back through love and choice. And that, Sarah thought as she tucked her babies into bed that night, made all the difference in the world.